All right. I know that people are still trying to get food. We're going to get started. It's okay if you keep getting your food, so no problem with that. Welcome, everyone, and good evening. I'm Pari Viahi, and I try to run this lecture series for the Department of Architecture. We have the pleasure of hosting Eric Bunge from An Architect, and I'll just briefly introduce him, and then we'll proceed to the lecture. Eric is a co-founding partner of the Brooklyn-based An Architect and an adjunct professor at Columbia University. He received a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design and a B.Arch from McGill. He previously taught at Parsons, RISD, and Columbia, and as a visiting professor at Harvard, Yale, UC Berkeley, and University of Toronto. He leads the firm An Architect with his partner Mimi Huang in Brooklyn. The recent projects include Carmel Place, which we have referred to numerous times in our studios, the Design Center ADO, the New York Equal Rights Heritage Center, and the renovation of the Chicago Navy Pier. They have obtained the 2017 National AIA Institute Honor Award in Architecture, a 2016 Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture, and the AIA New York Andrew J. Thomas Award for Pioneers in Housing, and the 2006 Arch League Emerging Voices. Through their ephemeral and built work, An Architects have continuously engaged with the themes of permanent and transient, fixed and flexible, and material and immaterial. Their work exposes the fragility but also the resilience of architecture in countering change and transformation. Forward-thinking and playful, their visions, projects, and installations gives hope of an architecture that is flexible, agile, and accepting of different social, cultural, and economic forces. Please join me in welcoming Eric.
Thank you, Pari. Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me in the back? Good. Pari, that was a very efficient introduction because it was so good and so short. I really appreciate it. So, I'd like to see a show of hands. Who are master's students? Okay, who are undergrads? And faculty? In the front. I want in the back. Okay, great. Thanks. So, Buildings and Almost Buildings, which is the title of our book published last year, a few copies of which I was able to bring, is about questions we've been asking about both the physical aspects of architecture and experiential aspects as well. But first I wanted to show you where we work from. This was just asked. We have our office here in Dumbo, which is in Brooklyn, right across from Manhattan, and we've been there for the last 14 years, having started our practice 20 years ago. When we had finished our Canopy MoMA PS1 installation in 2004, we'd hang out like flies on the wall, watching basically as people would appropriate our work. We were anonymous spectators of the activities around us. The project was conceived as a kind of armature for microclimates and social exchanges, but it had no overt boundaries. This is 16 years ago, so for all this time we've been thinking about this idea of basically the almost building, a building that is somehow lacking something, that invites transformation or appropriation by others. And we started calling them the others. We call them not just users, but misusers. As you can see, somebody put toilet paper on the bamboo. Or this unsolicited photo somebody sent us in 2004, which we've kept, of course. So we're interested in all these misuses, which one can't really anticipate, are kind of a critique of program, the idea of program in architecture. At the end of the summer of 2004, we sold the bamboo to the artist Matthew Barney, who was also a filmmaker. He was making a film with his wife Bjork, for which he was going to use the bamboo once again as a kind of a scaffolding in the film. We were happy to recoup some of our debt from the project, which we built. Not much. But actually, more so, we really love the fact that the armature was going to sort of have a new life. So is architecture necessarily complete? Or is it, in fact, its indeterminacy that incites us to engage with it? Whereas we would make some of these early installations as building-like as possible, since then we've been doing the reverse. We've really been thinking about ways to create buildings and public spaces that somehow, embrace some of those qualities of ambiguity and incompleteness, shall we say, in positive ways. at what level is architecture incomplete? This is a question that has been evolving over at least 100 years in connection to the evolving ideas about, or concepts about space, which is a term introduced into the discourse of architecture in the late 19th century, but that we, as we know it now, has really only been around since de Stijl and the Einsteinian relativity, this idea of space as a continuum. So at some level, this question really couldn't have been asked exactly in this way until about 100 years ago. So we ask it in three frameworks in our book. We look at armatures, boundaries, and zones. At its most reduced, one could say that architecture is often represented as an armature. So Logier's primitive hut, which you see on the left, often competes with cave or nest as a kind of hypothetical origin for architecture. 150 years later, Le Corbusier famously introduces Maison Domino, the domino house, which one could say is a kind of X-ray of architecture's constructive potential. It's incomplete in some ways. So we see these as almost buildings, somehow between building, or midway between building and something else, perhaps nature on the left. The fact that they're missing something is actually really exciting to us. For us, they're sort of armatures capable of endless reformulation. So we're interested in that social aspect of how these are occupied, but also in the formal aspects, their informality, the uncertainty, and the open-ended work that results from thinking that way. In the 1960s, the armature was promoted, one could say, to megastructure, allowing many architects an easy expansion from the scale of building to city. However, we're also interested in the armatures at a more finite scale of buildings where one could say field and surface meet. For a competition for Detroit's waterfront, we proposed a 2,100-foot long armature. And this was a competition that we collaborated with the landscape firm James Corner Field Operations. Some of you may know from the High Line. We frequently collaborate. So Detroit, like many waterfront cities, is trying to kind of appropriate or reclaim formerly industrial sites that are empty and that really need density, but there's just not enough density. So we imagined a way to create a kind of a framework that would gradually accrete or grow with some kind of density as a kind of catalyst for this underutilized area of the city. For a long time, as probably many of you in your studio works, we were trying to break down the scale of this long armature, through different sort of formal experiments. But we sort of realized in the end that what would really be interesting about the armature is, in fact, how it would transform over time, and we therefore kept a very kind of simple framework that would basically maintain a tension with the things underneath it and above it that would occupy it over time. So greenhouse buildings, park buildings, storage equipment, basketball hoops, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, the idea is we don't know how it would be appropriated. So we imagined this long armature comprised of glulam timber, much like the way this building is built, actually, and steel, that would stretch along, the full length. We did argue to the jury that it could be built over time. A small nuance I think they missed. We didn't win this competition. But open porch, as we called it, is intimate in some places, endless in others. So since then, we've been working on buildings that really are armatures. I'm going to show you two of them. We have three right now, two of them under construction. This is the first time I show this project. It's a park pavilion for Hoboken. We're collaborating with the landscape firm Olin in a new park, which has the mouthful of a name, Northwest Resiliency Park, the goal of which is to absorb 1 million gallons of water. So this park pavilion is the only building in the site. Unfortunately, my team didn't send me the site plan, but Hoboken is right across the river from Manhattan and floods immediately, even with just a quarter inch of rain. So this new park will accommodate or absorb the water, but also provide new, cultural programming. So we're interested in this idea of, again, kind of questioning the limits of a building. So in fact, here there are two, a mini campus, if you will, two very simple volumes. One of which is a food and beverage volume, and the other one, which is just for community use, has film screening, bless you, and all kinds of things, bathrooms, etc. But what really is exciting to us is just this canopy that unites the two. It's just a shade canopy with some rain cover in some places. This is a worm's eye axonometric looking up, in which this really is the spaces in between these volumes, which are clad in a very thick kind of granite. That has we have no idea how these plants will look, these growing vines. This is just Photoshop, if you will. But we do imagine eventually that these vines will appropriate the building in a sense, as will people with some of the benches, swings that we're going to be installing, things like that. So again, as we work on this project, it's able to adapt. We can hang something else on it. We can change the cladding and so on. But that's a small armature. We're working now on a project that's under construction. It will be complete on Labor Day in Long Island, New York. It's the Jones Beach Energy and Nature Center. It's a really exciting project from a few vantage points. First of all, it's sited on the west end of Jones Beach, which is a barrier island created by Robert Moses in the 1920s. So one can't really consider this a natural condition. This was sand that was dredged from the sea and then built up. But it's also become a nature preserve, so it's full of interesting contradictions. We've already demolished 2/3 of the concrete parking that you see in this photo and have turned it already into rubble that we're using as subbase for roads to help lift up the building and so on. So none of it's leaving the site, but we're basically stewarding a dune reclamation project to really bring it back to the dunes. Jones Beach is one of the parts of the better legacies of Robert Moses through his creation of some very sort of civic and public amenities and beaches. I mean, not exactly for everyone. It's not without controversy, but it is kind of a grand vision between the wars and before the Second World War about public space. Our project is situated at a much more quieter end of it, a nature preserve. So now this slide shows you the ghost of the parking lot. I don't think you see my mouse, but so what we've done is remove a lot of this parking around the building to immerse visitors. The building is a very linear building, 330 feet long, in part because we demolished an existing building and we're reutilizing the piles and the grade beams of that building for economy, but also because we can't really build closer to the sea. There's a coastal erosion hazard area line, and frankly, we wanted to have a linear building because then we can see the beautiful view of the ocean. It's a building that is characterized by this waveform, as we call it, these waves, which became a kind of unwittingly a symbol for both energy and nature. The building's program is really as an education center, a visitor center, or one could say a small museum that will educate people, visitors, about correlations between energy and nature, both positive and negative. So, of course, many energy systems, non-renewable sources, have a negative impact on nature, as we know, but natural systems like hurricanes will take down an electrical grid. Conversely, we can talk about renewable energy, right? So this is the Governor Cuomo's sort of poster child for his climate action plan, which has dictated that state-funded buildings will have to be net zero by 2050, which means they'll have to produce as much electricity as they consume. Our building will be doing that 30 years before that time. It's a building powered by 300 photovoltaic panels and I think 24 geothermal wells, which is not off the grid. It can put energy into the grid and back and forth so long as it's a net zero exchange. The interior organization of the building is really one of a sort of a long gallery within which there are a series of volumes that include things like offices, education spaces, support spaces, mechanical rooms, and so on, in a way to really maximize the surface area for exhibition and to create a continuous kind of fluid experience for visitors. So we've had to elevate the building 7 feet above the existing ground plane because of new flood resiliency regulations, which also has the advantage of really creating this amazing deck from which to see the ocean. One day soon we'll be able to see large wind turbines out in offshore wind turbines off in the distance. And in fact, the exhibition inside will celebrate solar technology, wind turbines, etc., and really sort of unpack those and explain how those work. But always with a kind of connection back to nature. So also we're hoping that in the nature side, because there's still two sides, we really wish we were a bit more mixed, that one would understand how much energy it takes for a whale to breach and really educate not just children, but all kinds of visitors about this correlation. The building is wrapped around by a porch, a kind of armature as we see it, that we've scaled according to solar orientation, but also that, again, will sort of sponsor the unknown. So on the south side, we have this 12-foot deep armature. that syncopates with the geometry of the building. You may notice that, like water, things don't quite line up. Columns, beams, the trellis itself with the building volume. Again, to create this kind of very dynamic set of conditions that are not static, but with very minimal means. We just have a few elements and materials. And the idea is to create many different lighting conditions, many different spaces with some kind of economy. There are two kinds of spaces in the building. Flat roof spaces like offices and these clerestory pitch roof, like this building actually, a little bit. Spaces like the galleries, the lobby, and so on. And so we're bringing in northeastern light. The building materials are very simple. Just Douglas fir, glue laminated timber, also Douglas fir structural decking, so no concrete or steel in the inside. So we can have a very clean ceiling, no mechanical. All the mechanical is in the floor or in these volumes, so we can have a very primitive architecture, which is something we're always trying to achieve. That really asks you to focus on the content and the site, which is, in a sense, the context as content, which is a topic I want to return to in another project soon. So the project is under construction. This is a few months ago. It's an interesting image where they've driven all these timber piles, which they then chainsaw to the right datum, and they're supplemented by concrete grade beams. So please come and visit after Labor Day. It should be open. As we've been thinking about the armature, we've also been thinking about boundaries and zones. As the armature has oscillated between disappearance and clear expression, we've also been exploring these similar questions. Can a boundary be complete and incomplete in different ways at different times? We like making holes, like Gordon Matta Clark, as you see on the left, cutting, creating gaps from the shallow to the deep in an attempt to confound limits between buildings and their contexts. So it's sometimes in our work, as I'll show in a couple of projects, it's an act of sneakily transferring private land to the public, even if it's a small amount. But also, we're interested in this idea that there's not a single boundary, not a single thickness of a facade, but potentially multiple incomplete layers that ask you to question where that limit is. Conversely, at what thickness does a boundary become a zone? And a boundary elevated to space? I think this is a question that's probably inflected by where you live, the climate within which you live, and so on. But if we progressively erase a zone, at what point does it read as incomplete? Within this framework, on the left, you see Le Corbusier's Villa Baizo, which is a house he built in Algeria, or in Tunisia, in 1928. This is the actual house that he built. It's not the one that's canonically kind of shown in the Œuvre Complète, his complete works. But it's the one that the client demanded, because Lucien Baizo knew the climate. And so what it is a series of porches with different volumes inside. So each floor plan looks quite different. And you can imagine as a strategy that this incomplete gray area is really kind of a resultant, right, between the perimeter and these volumes. Conversely, on the right is a drawing of Kamlongen Castle, one of the many castles that Louis Kahn was fascinated by. And this is quite different because these zones, if we see them as incomplete zones, are really kind of a progressive erasure of this wall, but they have clearly defined geometries. So we're interested in sort of both ways of thinking about this. If we move from the perimeter of a building to its center, thinking of type, you could think of verandas as an example of this, maybe light wells, courtyard, or in section we can think of the elevated ground plane favored by the modernists, maybe the loggia in Renaissance building or covered roof. So we're fascinated in either case by these zones, which we understand more as spatial structure than, which is a more neutral term than type, sort of sidesteps these sort of loaded issues, but the capacity for these zones to inform the spatial structure of a building. In 2015, we were approached by car brand Mini, which is owned by BMW, to transform an industrial building in Brooklyn's Greenpoint. We were very relieved that there were no cars involved. This is part of their kind of pivoting of their business plan away from cars, actually, to think about the company as a design company that would basically embark on many ventures. So there's Mini Living, they're thinking about fashion and so on. But this is about design conversations, creating a sort of incubator for design. So the many name changes of this project sort of paralleled its evolving ambitions, and we were sort of part of that, which was interesting. At first it was called Grassroots Box by the client, which had a horrible heaviness to it, but it reflected their desire to not land a spaceship in Greenpoint's manufacturing district, but really to sort of listen to, and incorporate and engage all the a lot of people in the neighborhood. Then it became free space, a term that we came up with when we developed our design. I'll show that in a minute. And then finally they settled on ADO. You may have heard of it now. It's become a kind of cultural institution, at least if you've gone to New York recently. But that stands for Amalgamated Drawing Office. That's the office that designed the first mini car in the 50s. This is what we started with, and we like to say we love ugly buildings because there's so much potential in them. It's like the moment we see an RFP with an ugly building, we go for it, basically. It was a bra factory, and it had very kind of opaque, zero relationship to the public or context. So our first instinct was to cut a hole. We removed the corner of the building, a triangular space, creating New York City's newest little park, not really a park, but a public space for anybody just to hang out. And we cut many holes, but in all of this, we saved the bricks because we thought that we wanted to be ambiguous about how we would build them back and not actually articulate these erasures with some other material and so on. So we asked the contractors to carefully keep the bricks which had been covered with graffiti and then reassemble them into what we started calling reconstituted graffiti. And honestly, this came out much better than we ever expected. But it was kind of funny when the graffiti artist came back and just spray painted over it and started tagging our innovation, we thought. But we had to accept that if we really believe in this idea of appropriation, right? So that's fine. So this logic of remixing the context, the neighborhood, and so on, really governed a lot of our thinking about how we intervene in the building. So we made many holes, all of them square in relationship to all the garage openings in the industrial neighborhood. And we also continued the spirit of remixing throughout the project, both in terms of physical transformations, but also how we brought program together. So physically, if we were to cut a trench for an electrical conduit, we would leave it patched. We would never try to show to hide that. So all the traces of steps were exposed. But also programmatically, it was interesting. It's kind of a building department's nightmare because there's a restaurant, which you see on your left, the free space, which I described before, that kind of fluid space that you see. I don't have a pointer, but that cuts through the plan and connects many different programs. There are spaces for designers in residence. There's a small gift shop. And on the right side of the project, there's an incubator where they have a program where they venture capitalists fund, I think, a cohort of something like 10 companies every 6 months. They give each company $100,000 for inventions that improve urban life, either physical or digital. So actually there's some really interesting work happening there, and there's a culture around this because you get to see what they do, and there are kind of conferences where people expose the latest inventions. There's also, on the bottom right, a workshop that you can become a member of. But most importantly, anyone can go there, open up your laptop, and actually get free Wi-Fi. So it's become like people's free office, which is exciting to us. On the top of the plan, you see this space with some beams. This is a smaller building where we removed the roof and put in a steel frame without any program. We really convinced the client that let's just not plan this one. Let's just pull off the roof and see what happens. And indeed, it's become an interesting space. So we designed a restaurant. The restaurant connects to all these spaces. Typically, you have like fire separations between all these uses. Perhaps not in a building like this, but it became really an interesting challenge to connect all these things together. In the middle of the space, we created what we call a periscope. And this came out of the impossibility of actually having a second floor for many reasons, budget, accessibility, zoning as well. The client, based in Munich, thought it was very important to see Manhattan. We said, well, we'll bring Manhattan to you. So if you look up on this periscope, at this periscope, you see two mirrors. And they reflect, one of them reflects Manhattan, the other one reflects Brooklyn, depending where you stand. When you stand at one certain point, we join together the skylines, so you can actually see Brooklyn and Manhattan merged as if the river didn't exist. But it's kind of interesting. It also sponsored artists' interventions on the roof. Here you see a painting that an artist did, which of course gets replaced with beautiful snow sometimes. So you have a very interesting repositioning of environmental conditions as you look up. And it's become a kind of Instagrammable moment, which is a horrible thing that clients are asking architects to design now. But it actually happened. It didn't come from that prompt, though. It came from the prompt that we can't get up there. This is the space where we just removed the roof and put in a galvanized steel frame. And it's just been interesting, installation after installation, to see how different architects or artists have appropriated this. This is London's Assemble, who created a little factory with a clay extruder, and they built this step by step. United Visual Artists created this really interesting installation, which really captured some of the spirit of the project. There have been kinetic, interactive ones as well, and parties. So it's kind of an interesting space. So another name change. This project, which opened November 18th, 2018, just a year and a bit ago, it's called the New York State Equal Rights Heritage Center in Auburn, New York. Auburn is in the Finger Lakes District in New York, at the crossroads of many exchanges of progressive ideas in the 19th century about equal rights. The site was a municipal parking lot in front of City Hall, and next to the museum, a former mansion of William Seward, who was the Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln and a governor of New York, and famous for the purchase of Alaska, but more importantly for the abolition of slavery. He and his wife as well, very important. Maybe more importantly, this city is the city where Harriet Tubman spent the last 50 years of her life. So not too far from here is her former home, which is also a national site. So we had, in a sense, two contexts that we were working within. One is the very historical context, one could say not unlike Amherst, with some very beautiful historical buildings. And the other one really is this sort of context of progressive ideals. And it exposed, in a sense, within the populace, a kind of very different sets of reactions. They were very resistant to anything new building. Many people were, I was telling Parry, were very sad to lose their municipal parking lot, even though there's a parking garage right next to it, which they didn't even want to go into. So we came in as sort of lead designers, not just of the building, but the site, and said, no cars. We created a plaza, an oval-shaped plaza, which you see has a statue of Harriet Tubman now in it. That wasn't planned. That happened just before opening. And then a little passive recreation space in the back. However, the client and the city and everybody else were really receptive to the interior, all the ambitions of the interior, which is an exhibition we co-designed, and which didn't have a curator. It just sort of happened in this very rapid process. 6 months between first sketch and bidding, and then and overall 19 months between first sketch and ribbon cutting. A very fast process for those of you who have worked on a building. That's not maybe typical, especially when the identity of the building is also changing. So when we first got the project, it was just a community center, and then it became a community center with a small exhibition about equal rights. Then it became an Equal Rights Heritage Center. Then it became the New York State Equal Rights Heritage Center. So the pressure was mounting and mounting, and I think maybe we wouldn't have gotten this project if if it had been that. It would have been so competitive, so it was nice. So we scrambled, designing really quickly. We call this table our landscape of inefficiency. Just over and over again, trying through models to understand how to break down the volume. The budget was tight, so we really couldn't build a big enough building to compete or relate to some of the context. So we looked at the houses. This neighborhood along South Street in Auburn is characterized by these very beautiful federal-style houses, all of which have certain footprints. And on the right, you see our footprint, this was the kind of diagram that really clinched it in terms of the client, understanding what we were trying to do, breaking down the volume, but in such a way not only to relate to the context, but also to engage with it so that context became content. Because as a building that exhibits aspects of the struggle for equal rights, some of those aspects were right there, like the William Seward House Museum. So we opened up the building to engage with those views. And like the Jones Beach Energy Nature Center I showed you, which is a project that emerged from this one actually, we consolidated services and back of house in these cores so that the viewers or visitors would always be facing the outside, facing the context as they perambulated around the building. And it's also a trick to make really small buildings seem a little bit bigger, is no dead ends. So we learned that from earlier projects as well. So visitors basically walk through the building, encountering different media that represent the struggle for equal rights. Here you see a drone photo looking down at the building, and you'll see how it opens up. It connects to the Seward House Museum. The image that really clinched it was this screen capture from a Rhino model, where the client understood, again, what we were trying to do. And here you see it built just a few months later, where you see the Seward House Museum, beyond, with a very kind of intimate, small triangular outdoor space. Again, we're trying to bring the outside in and challenge those boundaries in the work. Because of the speed of the project, we decided to use cast-in-place concrete as the structure and the finished material, which really allowed us to actually move quite quickly. But also, we were looking for a very primitive architecture where it really is just concrete on the inside, brick on the outside, and then a terrazzo floor with radiant heating. So really, there's nothing. There's no kind of ducts and products, suspended ceilings, that kind of architecture that we were trying to avoid. But it's a smaller building. It's a bit easier to do that. The first thing you encounter is an oversized little lobby where we installed a chalkboard that has a map of the city, with the idea that chalk is pretty low tech, but you can always update it, correct it, and the client can take it over. And this is sort of a MO that continues through through the building. So there's a permanent exhibition called Seeing Equal Rights, which we co-designed with our partners, graphic designers. That it starts with some benches we designed, which are based on the bathymetry of these deep Finger Lakes. Again, trying to connect these sort of more regional or even global issues of equal rights really to where we are now in the Finger Lakes district. The exhibition is not organized thematically, but by medium, because actually these themes cross over. So if you're looking at the struggle for women's rights, you'll find intersections with abolition of slavery. Some not all positive, actually, but very interesting ones. So really, actually, by keeping it by medium, maps, portraits, speeches, songs, things like that, posters, you can cut across different themes. The speech island, which we designed, is a little fun thing where you can press a button and listen to excerpts of speeches, but spoken with contemporary voices. So you can actually hear a child or the great-grand niece of Harriet Tubman reading a speech that now comes alive and becomes contemporary, and we understand that these struggles continue today. In the foreground, this is what we call the social justice table, a table where there's a circular video screen that allows you to see the enactment of legislative milestones, but also to engage with the exhibit on a personal level with these iPads. And there you see these portraits, posters, in the little plaza, not a plaza, the little cut, as we call it, and ultimately the other side opening up to the context. So the building sort of it tries to make sense of the scale, even though it's a much smaller building than its surroundings. On opening day, November 18th, 2018, a light snow had fallen. It wasn't quite complete in the literal sense, but we had an opening, and one of the lovely things about it was to meet the great grandniece of Harriet Tubman. You also see Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, who came and cut the ribbon. It was a very important thing for this city. It had not built a municipal building since that parking garage in the 80s. It's a very special moment. Now, after all the controversy about losing a parking spot, about a building that didn't maybe fit perfectly into what the people thought was a historical building or a contextual building, it's become sort of Auburn's living room, and it's been also having an enormous impact on the economy locally with farmers markets and things happening in the plaza and things like that, not to mention many events connected to equal rights. 10 years before that, we were one of 100 architects invited to design a 1,000-square-foot house in Inner Mongolia, China, which sounds strange, in a project curated by Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist and activist. And so here you see the big model with all of the firm's sort of inserted models. And ours, since I have no pointer, I can point. It's this one in the foreground. It's a lottery. Can you imagine that, all of you designing this thing? We were actually a little bit shocked at the brief. It was really a speculative project. There were no clients. It was this very strange site, in fact, in this very distant city in Inner Mongolia called Ordos, which is one of China's energy centers. But it's a new city, kind of built from scratch, in a sense, near another one. So there are two intuitions that shaped our response. One was the one was the extreme weather. super, super cold in the winter, and then arid, not very pleasant either in the summer. And the other one was the size of the house. It was too big. So we imagined, as opposed to a typical home, we imagined living inside the installation, creating a smaller house that was heated and conditioned within what we call the outer house, that was passively heated and had different qualities. So while the inner house had windows and was slightly more refined, the outer house had skylights and is rough. It's like a building within a building. And we worked with the engineering firm Arup to produce a thermal model. This is back in 2008, trying to understand how sort of a calibrated leaking of heat from the inner house to the outer house would heat the outer house. So whereas we had double glazed windows on the outside, we'd have single glazed on the other outside, which is to the outer house, so that the heat could leak. And in fact, you could just open a door and let the heat, and that way, heat that space. All that we built, since this project collapsed with the Chinese bubble, the bubble of the Chinese housing market in 2008, was this 1-to-10 model, thermal model for the Seoul Design Olympiad in 2009, where instead of the brick perimeter, we built it with glass, and we put little dots that represented the temperature. So blue is colder, green is not as cold, and then red is hotter. And that mapped that hypothetical thermal model made on a day with a minus 20 degrees Celsius. The house itself is comprised of discrete volumes, each one that's designed according to sort of the need of that floor, and then stacked, and then they all live within this kind of brick and concrete box that is what we call the outer house. And by virtually stacking these, the roofs of the volumes below became these sort of terraces in between. Mind you, this is a very economical project because even though everything's stacked, we used parametric modeling to make sure everything aligned with just 4 columns. So we basically have a very simple structure that's economical to build. Since the project wasn't built, for our book, we made 2 renderings of it that show it as if it had almost been built. So we were trying to trick people with a joke. Obviously, it's not real. But this is a rendering showing how it might look, before finishes are applied and so on, as a kind of a ruin where we imagined this space just sitting there. And we wish it had at least reached this level, but it didn't. And the next project I'm going to show you also didn't get built. These are 2, but it's also in China. In this case, we were invited to participate in a competition to design a 1.2 million square foot library in Shanghai. And it was a concept level scale competition. My partner, Mimi, was just under 45 when we were invited, so she qualified as a young architect. So that's how we snuck in. We won this competition, and it was on TV and all that stuff, but it didn't get built, and that's a whole other story. If anyone wants to go for a drink, I'm up for it. But it was disheartening. But we wanted to create a very compact experience, like the house I just showed you, within this framework that it had to be 1.2 million square feet. So we created a compact volume, circular volume. We packed some program like the conference center, convention center, under this park-like plinth. We brought Century Park, which is like their Central Park, close to the building and within the building, and really try to create a very dynamic space that also felt intimate. So in that sense, we learned from Tianyige, which is China's oldest living library, and it's really comprised of 2 floors. There's a book storage floor and a reading room. So we took that as a binary code and replicated it, with the idea being that these thickened floors, which contain smaller offices, stacks, and things like that, service rooms, really could be read as 1 floor, so that visitors wouldn't think of a 10-story building, but maybe a 5-story building. That would be simpler and easier to navigate. So they would hopscotch and go from big floor to big floor, but also down into the smaller floors when needed. So it really tries to accommodate different users. But maybe more importantly, in terms of thinking about incomplete zones, each of these floors had their own, like the house I just showed you, sort of logic. But by superimposing them, we created a vertically continuous library, which is very difficult to do in a cultural building. I mean, libraries need to be accessible, they need to be very kind of, inviting and so on. So we were interested in how this superimposition of actually relatively simple floor plans could generate some of these conditions of a very lively home. So we thought of the library as home was the title of our competition entry, and each floor was titled, you may have seen it in the diagram, patio, living room, study, and so on, with this idea of being that it's kind of like a large house for the public. So in these thick floors, when you get closer, you realize that they contain stacks and so on. But again, you feel this kind of simpler, almost like an urban space. And we even use street lamp lighting on those, as you can maybe see in this rendering. The top floor results in some skylights. The facade was comprised of a series of terracotta panels that emerged from the original books in China, which were basically terracotta. So we imagined a sort of cable net structure that would support these unglazed terracotta tiles, which were glazed on the outside, creating a kind of a veil around the building, which would mitigate heat gain, but also create a more mysterious, ambiguous reading to the building as environmental conditions would change. So what do we do when we lose a competition or win a competition and it doesn't get built? We build a model, and so that we can at least have something in our office. So this was fun, although we already knew that this wasn't going to happen. And maybe that's why we did it, just to have a piece of it. But this is in our office now, this model woven with string, reminding us of hopefully better days to come. So we just finished our first building in Canada. It's in Calgary, Alberta. And for teachers in the audience, this is a lesson about really treating your students well, because our client was our former student. She was our student at Columbia and ended up becoming Calgary's first female developer, and we won an RFP. And it's a long story. So Calgary is in Alberta. It's kind of like the Texas of Canada. You don't want to talk about oil you do want to talk about oil. You don't want to talk about renewable energy there. They have all these statistics about how batteries are worse than fuel or whatever. But the point is the site was very challenging, and it's part of what they call East Village in Calgary, a new kind of area. Actually, Snowhead's library is there. Allied Works Music Center is also in this area. As you can see, it has a very strange triangular shape. And in the visitor center that is celebrating this area, there's a model that again includes little models provided by the different architects or developers, and there's CRs, the little white one. It's strange. It has an incredible relationship to the Riverwalk, a really wonderful public space that's phenomenal, with a new pedestrian bridge to a wonderful natural island. But the shape is such that we really had to, and I always forget the name of this, but what's it called when you have to do this under a pole? Limbo, that's right. It was like limbo with the sun, because we could not cast a shadow closer than 20 meters to the Riverwalk on September 21st at 4 p.m., which sounds like an Indiana Jones kind of, relationship. So using, of course, 3D modeling, we could really work with the geometry of the site, which was triangular. So I won't say it's automatic, but shall we say it was very much dictated by that. There was no floor area ratio or no maximum building height. It was a shadow envelope zoning. So the building is complete. We don't have final photos of it. I'll show a couple from the opening. But it has 2 restaurants on the ground floor, offices, and then residence on the top. We think of it as a tower without a middle, because it has kind of everything. But there's no backside, so the facade facing the street actually has the stair core, the elevator, the loading docks, really inhospitable, potentially, facade. So we brought windows into the egress stair and tried to really make sense of all of these things. And it's a gateway to, and here you can see it, photo taken in November, a bit rough, on the Calgary's amazing skyline. And so it's empty right now. There will be a restaurant and a little bike shop and the offices of our client and her residence on the penthouse. So she's lucky. But it's a simple building built with inexpensive materials, but that creates a cascade of decks that are going to basically activate this very public space. And we hope there will be performances and things like that on one day. And there's this famous backside, or front, if you will, that has all of that stuff, loading docks and so on, where we really try to carefully weave together all these constraints and clad the loading dock doors with the same material so that they kind of disappear. Now this is one of the first times I showed this project. After all 20 years in practice, we've never built a house. It's been one of our kind of thorns in our side, I think, for a long time. Our son got us this project. So we're getting projects from weird places, not the obvious ones. It's his friend's family. It's like a new country house for them in Dutchess County. We call it a house between forest and field. Dutchess County is in New York State, just north of New York City. And the site of 13 acres is interesting because it has a forest and a field. So we asked our son, what do you imagine it like? And he actually his little brother said it should be a tree house, but we misinterpreted that and imagined a house kind of that has the qualities of a forest, where rather than thinking about walls dividing zones, how can these zones be more fluid and complete, if you will, defined by what we understand as more like cores, like a chimney. But within that kind of framework, we're interested in a very simple canonical barn-like shape, which is characteristic of the region, hence the shape of the house. So in yellow, you see the cores, as we call them. They're clad in wood: chimney, storage, stair, kitchen, powder room, library. And these rise up to meet the simple roof, some of them meeting, some of them not quite, to create different lighting conditions with skylights over them, while we convince the client to put all the bedrooms on the ground floor so that they could live up in the trees, up in the sky. And so the house will basically have a real variety of spaces, despite its relatively modest size. It's bigger than mine, but but at the same time, we're interested in this being something that's slowly discovered. Really a very simple shape, clad in wood. But as you understand the layers of space inside with different lighting conditions, this will hopefully come alive. And in one space in the house, we decided to really literally make it incomplete. It's a covered porch where we continue the same cladding, but vary the spacing a little bit and support it, that whole area, by 2-inch square hollow steel sections, actually solid rod sections, that create a very delicate framework so you can look at view the landscape and bring that semi-outside, semi-interior or exterior space into the house. Has anyone been to Storm King, the art center? A couple of people. If you've been to Storm King, you might have walked by this piece by Alton Schatz. It's called Mirror Fence. You may have missed it because it tends to appear and disappear. In its form, it's the doppelganger of a picket fence, a generic picket fence, but rather than divide space, it dissolves into a landscape of varying light, weather, and seasons. So we're obsessed with similar ideas. How can we register the impermanent context of our projects? How can the perception of a building be folded into its surroundings, collapsing near with far, object with field? We're, of course, drawing from a very long discourse about ambiguity that starts with from Empson to Venturi to Rowe. Our focus has partly been on conveying material and temporal ambiguity, remixing context, destabilizing perception. So for us, we think about the Almost building as a building that's intentionally vulnerable to conflicting interpretations and resists a stable identity. In Chicago, we collaborated with James Corner Field Operations again on the renovation of Navy Pier, which is the #1 tourist destination in Illinois, apparently. So American waterfronts underwent 2 phases of redevelopment. The first really turned them into very carnivalesque places. And more recently, they've become slightly re-envisioned as slightly more natural size, more ecological, more connected to the city, but also to the ecology and so on. So it's an interesting pier because it was one of Daniel Burnham's piers in the plan for Chicago, and underwent many transformations. It was a people's pier. It became used by the Navy and so on. But then this is what we inherited: clutter, branding, Muzak, which actually there's still Muzak, but lots of stuff. And you couldn't even see the lake. This is looking down the pier on your left, so you couldn't see the lake, which is really beautiful. So as a team, led by our partners JCFO, who are the landscape architects, we decided to really unclutter the pier. Our scope as the architects on the team, and it was a competition we won, includes some of these structures you see here, but all of them have two roles, I should say. One is to create a social space, but the other one is to really connect people to the lake. I always hesitate to show this diagram because whatever comes after it can never be as good, but this was our sketch when we thought about how do we connect to the lake. And all of our responses in this project were disobedient, and maybe it's a kind of a topic that would be interesting to discuss. Like, how do we kind of read beyond the programs that are given to us by clients when we really have to be suspicious of them because we don't know if they're correct or if they're appropriate to changing needs. So the brief called for a series of kiosks that would sell boat tickets and food and so on, but we thought we don't want to add more clutter. So we joined them together under a canopy roof. And here you see a sort of collage explaining our ambitions to create a roof that connects you to the lake. So instead of having these two kiosks, we have the space now sheltered, and with this corrugated ceiling would really allow you to see the lake by virtue of its crenellations. And so the deep color of the blue, or the changing color as it goes through the seasons, becomes very, very apparent. And so we were really interested in, what might happen. Could there be music under here? Who knows, weddings, performances? Precisely the point is that it could have all of these things, or it could also be a very intimate space where you escape the heat on Chicago Navy Pier and just have a moment to yourself. One of the other pieces we designed, we call it Info Tower, but it came also out of a disobedient response to the brief. They asked us to create a gate that would say Navy Pier, which is what they had before. But we really thought, okay, it's a sort of pseudo-private public space. It's a public space, but it's run by Navy Pier Inc. It really shouldn't feel like an enclave, an urban enclave. So we wanted to address the underlying goals of this brief, which is to mark the entry, but not to define it as a boundary or a gate. So we created this info tower, which is a kind of a little bit of an inside joke on the Chicago Tower, because when you look up at it, it looks like it's part of the skyline. But we wanted to make that skyline leap forward and become, connect you to that. So collapse foreground and background, because it's only 45 feet tall. And so that's our kind of joke. People take pictures, look at it like that, and then it's really not that big. But it's the proportion of a tower. And it's designed with different frits of glass so that it really responds to different environmental criteria, always being different, and also a lighting system that is synchronized with the cycles of the moon. So you'll see this pulsating light that really kind of connects to something else that's not really there. In Seattle, we designed this after Navy Pier, but we've been waiting for the Alaskan highway to be sunk. We've designed 4 urban kiosks that are designed to connect sort of the major streets to their waterfront. However, we've just learned, unfortunately, that they're only going to build 1 and not the 4 that they initially asked us for. That's the problem with projects that go on for too long. They change. But we wanted to connect the city to the water, similarly to Navy Pier. But we were asked to design just a small kiosk that's 1 story tall, but maybe with a sign or something that would really be tall enough to connect to or be visible from the city, which is, if you've been to Seattle, it's on a hill. So they really wanted the waterfront to be present from the city, this new waterfront. So we really made this hybrid, if you will, between a space and a surface, a little kiosk and a sign, a simple form that goes from a block, if you will, to an angle, and which, in our view, would correct the view, because the way the streets meet the slips, the water, is at an angle, and the paradox is that the closer you get to the waterfront, the less you see the water. So by creating these mirrors at slightly different angles, we could refract, create a sort of kaleidoscope effect that would then connect you somehow to the broader context, including strategically aiming these at the Mount Olympus and did I say that right? Mount Olympus, the Olympian Mountains, right? Yeah, basically the broader context. And we argued that they should all be the same, which really is not an issue anymore since there's only going to be 1, but because they're really going to reflect different things and become kind of a beacon at night. So I was speaking about temporal and formal ambiguity. Even if we can understand those in architecture at a certain visceral level to be culturally inflected, it's certainly more so the case with a typology when you're confronted with a hybrid. So is Ponte Vecchio in Florence a fragment of a street or a continuous building? Although it started as a mere bridge, it evolved typologically to become a sort of ambiguous hybrid, a both and street and building. And we love thinking about this condition. If a building or something occupies a gradient between one thing and another, it's almost something, therefore almost something else. So in this case, is it almost a building? So we loved looking at hybrid buildings like this. To paraphrase art critic and historian Rosalind Krauss, we imagine architecture as a kind of data point in the spectrum between building and not building. Somewhere in between is this idea, the almost building. And we're really fascinated by the indeterminacy and the variety of interpretations that arise. Now, the most straightforward example of a typological hybrid in architecture, we thought, is between building and sign. For the Department of Transportation in New York, we were hired to renovate this area, this maintenance and repair area. And the tip of the iceberg, in terms of our intervention, comprised of two very small buildings. One is a diesel monitoring station, where we had a little bit of fun with road signage, basically telling the trucks which way to go. And an electrical transformer building, which steps up power, and that's the symbol for stepping up power. But our goal is really to bring a little levity into this kind of grim site, really thinking about the workers who are there and something they could be proud of and chuckle about. So there are these tiny little buildings, and they're lost in the middle, next to LaGuardia Airport. Please look out the window on the left side when you're landing. You might see these little buildings. We were invited in 2011, it was, to design an art installation in Hualien in Taiwan. And at that time, we've had to explain we're not artists. We really admire artists, but we don't have those abilities. But also, we're interested in designing sort of a functional space, something that can really be useful. And so the curator who invited us, and this is part of a very interesting kind of art festival that celebrated Taiwan's then President Ma's low carbon future target. And so it's trying to protect forest. So we researched the area and understood that it's a very beautiful area in the east of Taiwan. It's occupied by the Amis, who are non-Han Chinese tribes, and of which there are quite a few. And they wear a traditional dress sometimes. And they tell their stories through song and dance. And so we decided to build a polycentric theater, as we called it, with a series of 11 bamboo vaulted sort of band shells and a circular donut-like stage or seating area, and just to see what happens. And I'll show you what happened. So in this case, we didn't build it ourselves, but we had built our MoMA PS1 canopy in 2004, and we had worked with green bamboo and so on. So this was new, in fact, to our collaborators who are the Amis. They were, traditionally built with dry bamboo, which has been, treated against aphids and so on and so forth with smoke or something like that. So we really had to convince them and fly over there and build a prototype with them and show them how to do it. And this collage, which is in our book, shows how the bamboo was harvested just up the hill, carried by car or other means. We happen to have this photo, and then erected on site by our partners. And they were so excited at the end that they invited us into their sort of ancestral home, this little temple, which is all about bamboo. And we were told that we were like the first people in there, including our curator, had never been inside and so on. These photos, which capture the ceremony at the end of 2011, these photos by Yuan Ban, were so exciting to receive. We unfortunately couldn't be there, but we were amazed to see how it was occupied. In this case, you see the dancers in the middle. In this case, you see the singers on that perimeter deck. You also notice the audience is sitting on the same deck, which is again the case here. And we saw some other performances too. So this idea of a kind of armature that promotes different kinds of orientations, permutations, and so on, not this hierarchical space, is something that we're quite interested in. Now back to Navy Pier. The biggest piece we made in Navy Pier, and the reason we show it after that project in Taiwan was because it had some similar goals, but we managed to build it in a permanent way. The brief, again, called for a handicap connection between the South Dock and this plinth, which for all our competitors meant ramps. But having spoken to elderly people and people who are disabled, ramps are really, really difficult to achieve with a wheelchair. But more than that, there are spaces of passage, of constant movement, and we're actually interested in stasis in architecture. We want people to stop. So we propose a ground stair that could connect bottom to top. And we solved the issue of the accessibility quite simply with some glass elevators, some simple elevators, very discreet, actually better connected than a ramp, and also climate controlled and so on. But our idea was that this stair would modulate between overlook and stair. So it's a single kind of construction, if you will, that's comprised of a series of stringers, like a stair, and then clad with steps in some cases and louvers in others, depending on where you are along this modulation. Again, a kind of typological hybrid, if you will. In this case, a kind of a seamless one. So we built it with prefabricated steel cassettes. They were fabricated a couple of hours north of Chicago, that contained these steel louvers, which were then hung on these stringers, these stair stringers. So it's like building a staircase, except for you have different stringers. And then, which then created this kind of very seamless, if you will, conditions. So I hope you can visit the Chicago Navy Pier. It covers basically 30,000 square feet of retail. We really had to argue with the client that we're not blocking the retail. We're providing a space for public and civic enjoyment, which will elevate the value of the retail because people will get food and sit there, and it'll become a great place to look at the lake, a great place to hang out, as you can see in this photo. So people use it, in all kinds of ways. And one thing we didn't expect was our partners, James Corner Field Operations, created this platform, which is like a stage. So now, again, it becomes like a theater for performance. And this is not a rendering. It looks like a tacky rendering. These are photos of what happens every summer when the fireworks go off. So it's become a kind of interesting public space. Also working with L'Observatoire lighting designers, we created a very interesting experience at night in the space. In this last project, and actually after this last project, I'm going to show 3 images I'm not supposed to show, according to an NDA I've signed, but it's not being filmed, is it? It is being filmed, never mind. I won't say what it is. But in this last project, we're asking what happens when the idea of the Alamos building is considered the scale of the city. So on your left, you see Soria Imata. His linear city of 1882 proposed to blur the distinctions between industry, agriculture, and daily life. So at 500 meters wide, which is like 2 avenues in New York, about 1,500 feet, by however long humanity required. This was his idea. I'm sorry, this slide. Thank you for, somebody was trying to tell me. On the right, surely unaware of this earlier work, autodidact Edgar Chambliss proposed Road Town, which is a vision of a linear city. And I encourage you to find that little book. It can be read in maybe 30 minutes. It's a manifesto about a linear city that's connected by wires and pipes. And it sounds really logical if you read it. Everyone can just have their little workshop connected by transportation along this line, much like Le Corbusier's Algiers project many years later. So these linear cities, visionary works of architecture, influenced the Soviet disurbanists, the metabolists in Japan, and many other movements that followed. But for us, these mega buildings are problematic because they think of buildings as infrastructure and yet still delineate very sort of legible strips between building or city and their context. In this case, an agrarian kind of ideal utopian context. So we're more interested in a more messy engagement with the idea of infrastructure. And it's something we're still working on. It takes a long time maybe to build up a portfolio that really can explain this. But we're interested more in the ideas of Jaime Lerner in Brazil and his idea of acupunctural urbanism, where you can create a series of economical transformations that have outsized impact on the city. In 2012, we had the opportunity to contribute to a discussion about housing in New York City and the evolution of housing types, as well as the transformation of the zoning code. We were invited by the developer, Monadnock Development, to join them as the architect on a developer-led team to compete in a city competition called Adapt NYC, actually a national competition. So my partner Mimi and I had some initial concerns about designing microunits, to be really frank. We had lived in a very small apartment in the East Village, really small, but actually that's what made us realize we have to do this because it was a terrible apartment. It was like 375 square feet. The window looked out to a crazy person's balcony. It wasn't good. There were mosquitoes. It was small, mushrooms in the bathroom, you name it. It was the East Village, New York City. Don't ask. But so we thought really there should be a humane approach to creating small units that really emerge from a need, which is demographic change. So Carmel Place is on the east side of Manhattan on 27th Street, just west of First Avenue. It's on Google Maps already, which means it's there. And it's the first microunit apartment building in New York City, all microunits. In fact, it's the only one because the zoning codes, which were subsequently changed, 2016's zoning for quality and affordability, didn't quite adopt microunits. They allow them, but they don't allow them fully, which means that you can have some in a building, but then you have to have these larger apartments and so on. But what's the background? Early 20th century, Jacob Riis, Danish photographer, famously exposed the urban poor's plight, lack of access to air, light, overcrowding, and so on. And this actually galvanized legislators to enact legislation to improve that. So the average home in the U.S. has been increasing ever since then. around the Second World War, the average home in the U.S. was 1,000 square feet, roughly. And it kept on growing and growing. This data is a little bit old, but around 2007, 2008, it peaked around 2,700 square feet, I've read in other data. It went back down again with the crash, but it went back up again when the economy was good. But the paradox is that the demographic story is the inverse. Right now, or not now, because this is already a few years old, I really need to update this, but at the time of our competition, 82% of New Yorkers were comprised of non-nuclear families. 46% of them in Manhattan were single households, and so on. And this was a national trend, as you can see, Washington, D.C., Manhattan, etc. And also an international trend where New York is in fact trailing Stockholm and Amsterdam. And we can only imagine as Brazil, China, India's populations change, and many of the socioeconomic factors that contribute to this trend, which are the education of women, longevity, delaying of marriage, many things that have basically been happening have led to this tendency to live alone or in households of one or two people. So in an ideal world, we'd love to think of the house or the multifamily housing as a dispersed home where you have your space, but you also have a kind of a series of shared amenities and perhaps mobility as well. In this project, we were able to achieve this somewhat, and we're continuing to work on this. This slide shows something that we did not do. This was actually at the Architecture Center in New York City. This was part of the Adapt NYC competition. Citizens Housing and Planning Council had done a huge body of research that was really the document we got. And they had held this fantastic event where they mapped out a small micro-unit, and so there's a lot of fuss about it. We won the competition in 2012, or 2013, I would say partly because of this image. A rendering which we curated, where we imagined that we should show it under construction and show the means of construction using modular construction, which with our developer partners who owned a modular company, so that was actually kind of a given, we really thought was a strong sort of selling point and that a very good connection to the idea of micro-units, very quiet, very quick, and so on. So the city was really interested in this idea, I think, and really promoted it. 3 years later, the building opened. Now, it's a building comprised of 55 studios. All of them are rentals, just like any other apartment on a year-to-year lease. Of those 55, 40% of them are so-called affordable. In Manhattan, that doesn't necessarily mean that much. We can get into the fine grain of how that affordability is allocated according to different AMIs, area mean incomes. And that is the subject of political debate. So there are a lot of negotiations with council members, with community boards, not with us, but with our developer partners, with the city, who is our client, and so on, to get this project approved. The other 60% are market rate, and they're shockingly expensive. Our interest is that if there were more and more, we think, of these smaller units, eventually there would be more and more choices or options for small households, so that they wouldn't have to commute an hour and a half or 2 hours away, or live in illegally subdivided apartments, or maybe apartments with no view, or the crazy women on the balcony that we had. And I don't know if you knew this, but there's a law, that's in the Housing and Maintenance Code, which precludes households of more than 3 unrelated adults. And it's not really enforced very much, but it can be. So if you're 4 adults, you're not supposed to live together unless you're actually related. It's a very antiquated law. There are brothel laws, there are things like that. They're sort of playing into this. So it's a big challenge for the city actually to think about how do you introduce units that respond to this demographic change. So within this very limited footprint of 45 feet by 105 feet, we wanted to create as many shared spaces and as good shared spaces as possible. So on the ground floor, our lobby, rather than being a sort of small elevator lobby, was conceived of as a sort of urban street, with the idea that you could have a dinner for all the residents in the building because it's slightly oversized. And just by slightly oversizing circulation, it could become something else. We also put the gym in this spot. We thought it was a nice spot. And then a little cafe and little spaces for work. Now the units, there are 8 per floor before the building setback. They're all studios, but actually they're all, there's a sort of a range, typologically, shall we say, certainly volumetrically between them. giving a sort of a slight spectrum of choice and price point, actually, which is important to have. They're all modules, as this drawing in the book explains. It shows how they come together. They're basically like Lego, very simple. They're steel frames with a concrete floor, and I'll show you a little video, that are welded to each other. And they sit upon a base that we built first with standard construction, so that we could have the other site active in parallel with the real site in the factory. And this factory was in the Brooklyn Navy Yard on the other side of the river. And this is a typical day in the factory, where you see the kind of like Model T Ford assembly line. Upper right is earlier, and then it kind of does a loop and comes, and the one in the foreground is a bit later. But it's basically comprised of steel, hollow steel sections, 4x4s, mostly a couple of 4x6s, a couple of 4x8s. The entire building is supported by a forest of these columns within the partitions, which are just light gauge framing. And they're just stacked. There's nothing else. And this video shows in sort of time lapse what happened over a 3.5-week period as these modules were set, which is the term that we use for modular construction. And during that time, we couldn't enter. It was unsafe. So it was so exciting for us to enter it when we did the first time and see the module we knew very well from the factory, but suddenly we were in that same space, 80 feet or whatever up in the air. Now, across these different types of spaces, we were trying to achieve a few things. We created as tall a ceiling as possible. And instead of having windows and balconies, because we actually felt the balconies blocked the sky and blocked the ground. And in such a small space, we realized it's very important, we think, to have that sunlight. So we brought the outside in a little bit by having terrace doors and what we call a Juliet balcony, simply a structural glass balcony guard on the inside, which doesn't touch the floor. So you can open this door, which is 8 feet tall, and really feel the wind, as it were. And then incorporating mobile retractable furniture, of course, which gives it a lot of usability and so on. The ceiling height and the storage and so on are sort of more typical of, let's say, a 3-bedroom apartment. We were told by some brokers that this has more storage than a 3-bedroom apartment in New York City. So we started saying, and it sounds a bit like a real estate broker to say this, but that it was bigger in everything except for area. So it had that volumetric angle. The first person to sleep there was a New York Times editor, and she invited all her friends and blogged about it, 5 editor friends, and she had a dinner. And our regret was that she didn't cook it because there was a very nice, adequate kitchen, but ordered Chinese takeout. But it was interesting that, it's like demonstrating what it's like to live in this small unit. It can be done. And so actually people's perceptions of the project, which I won't hide from you, were certainly controversial. And certainly if you understand the idea of a small apartment in a vacuum, or not in the context of like impact on infrastructure and mobility and things like that, and affordability in the long run, can be interpreted differently. But when people actually visited it and understood how spacious it felt, so many of them were won over, and it was kind of a very positive transformation. And that happens on many projects where they have a lot of doubt, and then things change. This photo shows a little bit how small the building is compared to its neighbors. But the impact, of course, has been sort of outsized, because I had to testify in front of the city council and talk about small units. It had a kind of impact on the conversation, which we were really excited about. And in a way, we started to think, how can housing be sort of understood as infrastructure? So could we think of the units living beyond the 4 walls, a dispersed home that parallels the complexity of our lives? One aspect of the building, the formal aspect, is that it's comprised of what we refer to as 4 micro towers. We wanted to celebrate the beauties of the small dimensions, but we did not want to express the individual. So we were very against the idea of expressing each unit as a volumetric Lego block. So in fact, we suppressed the legibility, if you will, of the construction system in favor of the social networks that we imagined to be scaled within. So we looked at the context. There was a white brick building to the south on your right, and a gray NYCHA housing, a brown NYCHA housing building on your left. And we imagined that our building would be sort of a gradient between these. So we chose 4 matte glazed brick, from white to almost black, and really thought of the site as a kind of a gradient that connects rather than sort of just divides. So these 4 slender towers respond differentially to what they need to do and to the zoning envelope, but also hide all the mechanical equipment, which is one of our big obsessions. And I just learned from Pari that everyone's very upset about the building across the street and that all the mechanical rooftop equipment wasn't rendered. That's one of our obsessions. How do you actually think about all these things and just make it part of the diagram of the building, if you will? So can we think of the building as a microcosm of the city skyline? Can we think of housing as infrastructure? Where does one building begin and another building end? Are there intermediate conditions? So I'm going to show you just 3 slides of this project I wasn't supposed to, but it's in Miami. And it's a current project that's about 10 times the size of Carmel. And it's giving us an opportunity to think about some of these connections across housing, city, and landscape at a different scale. So it's unlike Carmel Place, it's a co-living building where in this very tall and narrow courtyard, which we call the canyon, all the shared amenities are going to crisscross and provide the sort of the heart of the building, where there's shared kitchens and dining rooms, a library, working spaces, gardens, etc. Really a place that's encountered through this sort of courtyard type. More on that soon. In a photo in our living room, 7 giant peas have invaded an Italianate garden. This is the whimsical work of artist and friend Nina Cacciadorian as part of her Seed Assignment series. It's basically, she makes these things on the airplane with the things at hand, in this case her snack and her in-flight magazine. It's become a daily inspiration for us in our search for an architecture that simultaneously occupies different realms. It's also a metaphor for our practice, the airplane cabin, a bit like our intellectual workspace, a space full of constraints and opportunities. So in our book, just a few copies of which are here. I apologize, a box was lost. We don't have that many. But you can get it on Amazon. We put forward an architecture that embraces impermanence and of things in their perception. So while notions of the incomplete largely refer to our physical environment or objective limits of architecture, notions of ambiguity refer to our sort of perception of those. So for us, the Almost building is an act of resistance to closure, a constant reminder to remain open-ended. Thank you. I'd be happy to take a few questions. In the back over there.
Can you tell me the square footage of the micro-units in New York?
Thank you for reminding me. I forgot to mention that. So net, they range from 260 to 360, with a median of 300 net, measured to the inside of the walls. In terms of the volume, they're 10% shy of a standard 400 square foot unit, which was the size that was the sort of the minimum size that predated our competition. I forgot to say 2 things about that too, which is that for this competition, we were given 2 mayoral overrides. One was precisely this unit size, which actually is derived or is produced automatically by other constraints like accessible clearances and things like that. And the other one is what we call zone density, which refers to the number of units in a lot. Yeah. And there's one in the foreground here. Hi.
Yeah. So across every project you showed, you either displayed like a very finalized model or a series of collages. Like what does that producing those? What role does that play in your overall process? Because I don't see a lot of collage in the physical models from most practicing architects at this point.
Thank you for pointing that out. I would say the models are a daily part of our work, and the collages are a new aspect that we produce for the book, but where we try to, we had all these photos of site construction and so on. We didn't want to show like a before and after. We really wanted, what we try to do in the book is reveal as many secrets as possible, just make it like open source, and so we just wanted to show, so by looking at that collage you can kind of see, oh, this was done first. It was really just didactic. But then we became enamored with the idea of an image or a drawing that doesn't have a single, time frame to it. So we're still working on that aspect. But the models are fundamental to our practice.
Do you build those yourself?
Yeah, all of them. Yeah, that's what we all do. And also mock-ups. We've just, we're designing a building right in front of the Whitney Museum right now in Manhattan. It's part of the Gansevoort Peninsula, and we're using UHPC, which is ultra high performance concrete. So we've had to make a one-to-one mock-up in our office, which is about this big, so that the client can see whether chewing gum, cigarette butts, whatever, it will get stuck in it. So we love that. And it comes from our maybe early tradition of building installations. I showed PS1, which we built ourselves with students, like you guys, over a period of 6 weeks or something. But that wasn't the only one. We did a few of those. So now we're kind of old and we draw, but we don't quite get out on the site like that with screwdrivers. but we loved that. We feel that that's really important for an architect, to just build stuff, that even if it's a model. Yeah. Over there.
How do you decide on materials when you're considering impermanence as a
Yeah.
part of your work?
Yeah. So just to qualify, when we say impermanence, we don't mean that it shouldn't last as a built construct, but that it should change, or that it should accommodate change. We actually want our buildings to be well built and last. Which is different from an installation where you don't have to worry about that. So the bamboo, in fact, you wouldn't build with green bamboo if you wanted it to last, right? But there's another angle to this, which is innovation, a much discussed topic. We actually try to limit innovation in our work, which sounds a little paradoxical. And by that I mean that we like to limit it into a place where we can really innovate, but we also want to the work to benefit from tried and tested practices in the culture of architecture and knowledge of construction. So we always find one spot to innovate, because we want to get things built, but also we're interested in the idea of economy conceptually. So we choose materials with a bent towards the natural and a reaction against assembled materials. We would never do a ceiling like this, ever. Like, we hate drop ceilings. I'd rather show the ducts and have another acoustic material, or invent something and choose a material. So we try not to shop, we try to make. So that's one of the things that guides the material choice. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, I think.